Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. If you had been born into a century shaped by war, plague, and restless ambition, would you have chosen caution or glory? In the pages of history we think we know, there are often questions we have never paused to ask. Tonight, we step into 14th century England, a land both confident and uncertain, ruled by kings who believed their claims stretched across the Channel, and by nobles who measured honour in steel and endurance. Before we follow one young prince into the noise of battle and the quiet of private doubt, we must first understand the world that shaped him. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Share your location and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. England in the early 14th century was not yet the confident island empire later generations would imagine. It was a kingdom of fields and forests, of market towns with narrow lanes, of stone churches rising from muddy ground. Most people lived close to the soil. Wheat, barley, and oats determined survival. Seasons ruled the rhythm of life. The majority would never travel far beyond their village boundaries. Their fears were practical: failed harvests, rising taxes, the arrival of disease. Their faith was constant and visible. Bells marked the hours. Saints' days punctuated the calendar. Heaven and judgment were not distant ideas but daily companions. Above this rural world stood a warrior aristocracy. Nobles trained from childhood to ride, hunt, and command. Armour was expensive and carefully maintained. Castles were not only defensive structures but centres of administration. Loyalty bound lord to king, yet that loyalty was rarely simple. Land meant wealth, and wealth meant influence. Alliances shifted quietly, sealed by marriage, broken by ambition. At the centre of this web of obligation stood Edward III, a king determined to restore what he believed was England's rightful prestige. His claim to the French throne, rooted in family descent, would ignite what later historians would call the 100 Years' War. To him, and to many around him, it was less a prolonged conflict than a defence of honour and inheritance. War was not constant, but it was recurring, shaping taxation, trade, and the mood of the court. Into this world, in 1330, a son was born at Woodstock Palace. He would come to be known as Edward of Woodstock, and later, by a name history gave him the Black Prince. The origins of that title remain uncertain. It may have referred to armour worn in later life. It may have been a description added generations afterward. In his own lifetime, he was simply Edward, Prince of Wales, eldest son of the king. His childhood unfolded within the guarded walls of royal residences, yet it was not sheltered from expectation. As the king's first surviving son, he was more than a child. He was a symbol. His education blended piety and discipline. Clerics instructed him in scripture and Latin. Knights supervised his training in horsemanship and weaponry. He learned to draw a longbow, to handle a sword, to endure discomfort without complaint. These were not hobbies, but necessities. A prince who could not command respect on a battlefield risked undermining his father's authority. Court life offered ceremony and structure. Meals were public affairs. Hierarchies were visible in seating arrangements and clothing. Silk and velvet distinguished rank. Heraldic symbols decorated banners and shields, teaching even a child the importance of lineage. Yet beneath this order lay tension. News from France brought reminders that claims to distant crowns required soldiers and silver. As the young prince grew, he observed his father's careful balance of charisma and calculation. Edward III cultivated loyalty through generosity and spectacle. Tournaments displayed knightly skill. Feasts reinforced unity, but taxation to fund campaigns strained relations with merchants and landowners. Wool exports to the Low Countries were vital to the economy, and disruption from war threatened livelihoods. Even a prince could sense when prosperity trembled. The boy's daily life combined privilege and rigor. Dawn prayers were followed by instruction. Physical training was constant. Hunting expeditions hardened endurance and sharpened focus. He was surrounded by companions, sons of nobles whose families hoped proximity would secure favour. Bonds formed in youth would later become alliances in war. Yet expectation carries weight. Being heir to a militant king meant comparison was inevitable. He was measured not against ordinary men, but against an image of kingship built on conquest. Courage was assumed. Hesitation would not be easily forgiven. When he was only a child, he was formally invested as Prince of Wales, a title with its own symbolic authority. Wales had been subdued by earlier English kings, but memory of resistance lingered. The title signalled dominance and continuity. For the young Edward, it was another layer of identity added, before he had chosen anything for himself. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France remained powerful. Its king commanded larger resources and population. English claims were bold but uncertain. Naval skirmishes in the Channel disrupted trade. Merchants worried. Villages whispered about conscription. The idea of war filtered even into distant parishes through tax collectors and returning soldiers. As adolescence approached, the prince's training intensified. Armour was fitted to his growing frame. He practiced leading mock formations. Chroniclers would later praise his early composure, but composure is learned through repetition. He had to master fear quietly. Medieval warfare was not abstract strategy. It was noise, mud, and proximity to death. Preparation meant accepting that reality. Religion shaped his understanding of duty. Confessors reminded him that kings ruled by divine allowance. Victory could be interpreted as favour, defeat as correction. This belief did not eliminate doubt, but it framed events within a moral structure. A prince was expected to be both warrior and Christian. In the villages of England, ordinary people observed these developments from afar. They saw coins stamped with the king's face. They heard proclamations read aloud in marketplaces. They felt the burden of levies. For them, the prince was distant, almost mythical, yet his future decisions would influence their taxes, their security, and sometimes their sons' lives. By his mid-teens, Edward was no longer merely preparing. War demanded participation. In 1346, when his father launched a major campaign into northern France, the prince accompanied him. He was about 16 years old. The expedition was ambitious. English forces landed in Normandy, raiding and advancing. The goal was not only territorial gain, but demonstration of strength. The campaign moved through countryside and towns, unsettling local populations. Fields burned, supplies were seized. Such actions were standard practice, designed to weaken enemy morale and provisioning. For the prince, this was the first sustained exposure to the consequences of strategy. Warfare affected farmers and craftsmen long before it reached kings. As the English army manoeuvred, French forces gathered. The confrontation would take place near the village of Cressy. The prince was given command of a division, supported by experienced knights. Whether this was symbolic trust or calculated testing, it placed him in real danger. On that field, amid uneven ground and tense formations, the prince's youth met reality. The longbow, a weapon English armies relied upon, would prove decisive. French cavalry charges faltered under arrow storms. Chaos spread. At one point, pressure on the prince's position intensified. Messengers rode to the king seeking assistance. Edward III reportedly asked whether his son was dead or wounded. When told he was still fighting, the king declined immediate reinforcement, saying he wished his son to win his spurs. Whether fully accurate or slightly shaped by later storytelling, the account reveals expectation. The prince was to prove himself. Survival and success were intertwined with reputation. He remained in command, and the English secured a remarkable victory. For a young man raised on chivalric ideals, Cressy was confirmation and transformation. It solidified his standing among nobles. It demonstrated to allies and enemies alike that England possessed not only an ambitious king, but a capable heir. Yet victory did not erase complexity. War continued. The siege of Calais followed, lasting nearly a year. Maintaining an army abroad required supply lines and steady funding. Merchants financed ventures in hope of profit. Taxation deepened. The prince observed not only battle but administration, the necessity of discipline, negotiation, and endurance. Calais eventually fell, becoming an English foothold in France. Its capture altered trade routes and strategic calculations. For ordinary English sailors and merchants, it meant opportunity. For French residents displaced or subdued, it meant disruption. Back in England, celebration blended with fatigue. Triumph brought pride, but campaigns were costly. The prince's image grew. Chroniclers praised his bravery. Poets attached to court culture emphasized his courtesy and restraint. Reputation, once formed, required maintenance. Every action would now be interpreted through the lens of Crécy. As he matured into early adulthood, Edward navigated the expectations of leadership. He participated in tournaments that reinforced bonds among the nobility. These events were more than entertainment. They were rehearsals for war and displays of hierarchy. Armour gleamed. Heralds announced lineages. Crowds gathered to watch controlled violence shaped by rules. Within himself, the prince likely balanced confidence with awareness of fragility. He had seen men fall. He understood that fortune shifted quickly. His father's ambitions continued to define national policy. England's identity increasingly intertwined with continental claims. In parish churches, prayers were offered for victory and stability. In marketplaces, prices fluctuated with news from abroad. Society moved forward under the shadow of conflict but did not pause. Weddings occurred. Harvests were gathered. Life persisted. By the end of this first phase of his life, Edward of Woodstock had crossed the threshold from royal child to recognized commander. He had absorbed lessons of discipline and loyalty. He had tasted acclaim. The world around him remained unsettled, politically ambitious, economically strained, religiously devout. And as he stood at the edge of greater responsibility, the path ahead was not yet fixed. He had proven himself in battle, but governance, marriage, and broader leadership still lay before him. The expectations of a kingdom rested quietly on his shoulders. In that turbulent century, choices were shaped by birth and belief as much as by desire. A prince could influence events, yet he was also carried by forces larger than himself, dynastic claims, feudal obligations, and the steady rhythm of a society accustomed to hardship. What, then, was truly within his control, and what was simply the current of history carrying him forward? The young prince returned from France not as a sheltered heir but as a figure already tested by experience. Victory at Crécy had not ended the war, nor had it settled England's claims. Instead, it had raised expectations. Nobles now looked to him as more than the king's son. They saw in him a future commander whose presence on campaign might strengthen loyalty and sharpen morale. Reputation, once earned, demanded reinforcement. England itself was adjusting to the consequences of prolonged conflict. Military success required continuous funding. Parliament, which represented nobles and certain towns, grew more assertive in granting taxation. Merchants involved in the wool trade calculated risks carefully, aware that disrupted shipping lanes could reduce profits. The prince watched as his father negotiated with financiers and magnates, learning that war was sustained not only by courage but by credit. His daily routine reflected this dual preparation. Mornings often began with mass, followed by consultation with tutors or military advisors. Instruction in law and governance expanded. He needed to understand charters, feudal rights, and the management of estates. Royal authority depended on knowledge of contracts and customs. In council chambers, decisions were shaped by precedent as much as by ambition. Chivalric culture reinforced his public image. The ideals of knighthood loyalty, bravery, courtesy were more than ornament. They were expectations woven into aristocratic identity. The prince's behaviour in tournaments, his generosity to companions, and his observance of etiquette all contributed to perception. Medieval society valued visible honour. Reputation could open doors or close them. Around him gathered a circle of young nobles whose families sought influence through proximity. Bonds formed in shared training and shared risk. These relationships were practical as well as personal. In an era without standing armies, loyalty of individual lords mattered profoundly. A prince who inspired trust could mobilize resources quickly. One who alienated allies faced isolation. The war with France did not proceed in a single, unbroken campaign. Periods of negotiation alternated with renewed aggression. Diplomacy required patience. Messengers crossed the channel carrying proposals and demands. The prince observed how rhetoric differed from battlefield clarity. Victory in combat did not automatically translate into political settlement. Meanwhile, ordinary life in England continued its fragile balance. Villagers worried about harvests and rents. Artisans in towns produced cloth, tools, and simple goods. Trade with continental markets fluctuated. News of campaigns travelled slowly but carried weight. Families who had sent sons to serve waited for word, sometimes in uncertainty for months. The prince's education included exposure to this broader realm. He was granted lands and responsibilities in Wales and other territories. Stewardship required oversight of local officials, arbitration of disputes, and maintenance of order. Even in youth, he began to understand that authority involved compromise and vigilance. Governance was quieter than battle, but no less demanding. The cultural atmosphere of the English court blended piety and pageantry. Feast days were marked with ceremony. Musicians and poets entertained guests. Chroniclers recorded events carefully, aware that memory shaped legitimacy. The prince grew accustomed to being observed. His gestures, clothing, and tone carried meaning. Silk garments and embroidered emblems reinforced status, yet they also imposed expectation. At the same time, Europe was changing in ways few could fully comprehend. Trade networks expanded. Italian banking houses financed monarchs. Maritime technology slowly improved. The prince lived in a world that felt stable in hierarchy but dynamic in movement. The Channel was not merely a barrier, it was a corridor of exchange and conflict. His father's ambitions remained central. Edward III sought to secure territorial advantage and recognition of his claim to the French crown. Campaigns were planned with strategic calculation. The prince participated in councils where routes were discussed and alliances evaluated. Exposure to such deliberations deepened his understanding of the relationship between vision and feasibility. Training in arms never ceased. Even in peacetime intervals, readiness was essential. Weapons required maintenance. Armour was adjusted as he grew into full adulthood. Physical endurance was cultivated through hunting and exercise. These activities were not leisure in the modern sense. They were preparation for potential mobilization. Within himself, the prince likely weighed expectation against personal inclination. He had been shaped for command, but the path was not entirely self-chosen. Royal birth limited freedom, even as it conferred privilege. Ambition was encouraged, yet deviation from duty was unthinkable. In 1348, Europe faced an event that altered its structure more profoundly than any single battle. The Black Death arrived in England. The plague spread rapidly, carried along trade routes. Towns suffered sudden losses. Villages saw familiar faces disappear within days. Fear intensified religious devotion and suspicion alike. The prince, like all nobles, confronted the reality that rank did not guarantee immunity. The demographic collapse affected labour and economy. With fewer workers, surviving peasants found themselves in demand. Wages rose in some areas, challenging established hierarchies. The crown attempted to regulate pay, revealing tension between necessity and control. The prince observed how crisis could shift social balance. Court life adapted cautiously. Gatherings were reduced. Travel carried risk. Religious observance deepened as explanation was sought in faith. For a generation raised in belief that events reflected divine will, the plague posed questions about judgment and mercy. The prince's own spiritual understanding was shaped within this environment of uncertainty. As the immediate waves of disease receded, England entered a period of adjustment. Labour shortages altered agricultural practice. Some lands lay fallow. Survivors renegotiated relationships. The prince, moving between estates and councils, witnessed a society reshaping itself while war still loomed. Renewed campaigns required recalibration. France, too, had suffered from plague. Political instability across the Channel created opportunity. The prince prepared once more to accompany forces abroad. His role expanded beyond symbolic presence. He was entrusted with greater operational responsibility. In these years, his identity solidified. He was not merely heir, he was commander. Chroniclers began emphasizing his decisiveness and discipline. Accounts of generosity toward defeated opponents enhanced his image. Medieval audiences valued magnanimity as proof of strength. Mercy demonstrated control. His personal habits reflected training. Early rising, structured meals, consultation with advisors, and regular devotion defined his rhythm. Even leisure was framed within hierarchy. Falconry outings reinforced camaraderie among nobles. Discussions around hearths combined strategy with storytelling. The economic strain of sustained warfare required innovation. Ransom became a significant element of conflict. Captured nobles were held for payment, creating networks of obligation and negotiation. The prince learned to navigate this system, balancing honor with practicality. War had its own economy. Across England, the memory of Cressy remained vivid. Veterans recounted events in taverns, songs circulated celebrating victory. Such narratives bolstered morale and national identity. The prince's name was associated with competence. Expectation grew that future engagements would confirm this pattern. Yet each campaign carried unpredictability. Weather could alter plans, supply lines might falter, allies could hesitate, leadership demanded flexibility. The prince's experience deepened not through isolated heroism, but through sustained exposure to complexity. In his mid-20s, he stood at the threshold of full authority. His father remained vigorous, but age would eventually shift responsibility. Nobles assessed the prince's capacity not only to fight but to govern. Diplomacy required tact as well as resolve. Social tensions persisted beneath surface order. Labour laws restricting wages caused resentment among common people. The memory of plague lingered. Taxation for war did not diminish. While rebellion had not yet erupted, unease simmered quietly. The prince's generation inherited a kingdom proud yet strained. Culturally, England affirmed its chivalric identity. The Order of the Garter, established by Edward III, symbolized elite unity. Membership signaled trust and honor. The prince's participation reinforced his centrality within this circle. Rituals, emblems, and shared oaths created cohesion among leading nobles. Through these intertwined experiences, battle, plague, governance, ceremony, the prince matured into a figure shaped by both privilege and pressure. His confidence was tempered by exposure to loss. His ambition was structured by duty. The world around him remained unsettled, yet it offered opportunity for distinction. As the 1350s advanced, preparation gave way once more to action. France, weakened by internal divisions, became the stage for renewed confrontation. The prince would soon lead forces with greater independence, testing whether the promise of youth could sustain the burden of command. In a society where lineage defined destiny, how much space remained for personal choice? The prince's path seemed clear, yet clarity does not eliminate uncertainty. England watched, nobles aligned, and history moved forward not with certainty, but with momentum. By the early 1350s, The prince was no longer defined primarily by his first experience of battle. Youth had given way to practiced discipline. The years after Cressy were not idle. They were formative in quieter ways. War had proven his courage, but sustaining authority required more than bravery. It required steadiness, patience, and a visible adherence to the codes that governed aristocratic society. Chivalry in the 14th century was not an abstract ideal, but a structured expectation. Knights were bound by ceremony, oath, and reputation. The prince lived within that structure daily. His armour was maintained with care, not only for protection but for symbolism. Heraldic devices displayed lineage and claim. Even the arrangement of colours on a shield communicated continuity with past generations. Tournaments became regular features of his life. These events were complex gatherings combining sport, politics, and spectacle. Nobles travelled long distances to participate. Temporary wooden stands were erected for spectators. Merchants set up stalls selling food and cloth. For common townspeople, a tournament offered rare proximity to royal presence. For the prince, it was rehearsal and display. He rode in full armour before assembled crowds, lance steady, posture controlled. Success in these contests reinforced his standing, yet tournaments were governed by rules meant to reduce fatal risk. Unlike battlefields, they allowed calculated demonstration. Through them, the prince honed not only physical skill but public composure. Within the circle of the Order of the Garter, bonds tightened. Founded by his father, the order sought to unify England's leading warriors around shared identity. Meetings blended prayer and celebration. Members wore distinctive insignia. The prince's inclusion affirmed his position at the centre of England's martial elite. It also required loyalty beyond personal ambition. Daily life at court reflected layered hierarchy. Meals were structured according to rank. Servants moved efficiently through halls carrying roasted meats, bread, and wine. Conversations centred on land disputes, foreign developments, and family alliances. News arrived through messengers and letters sealed with wax. The prince learned to listen carefully, weighing words before responding. Beyond courtly refinement, the realities of governance demanded attention. He was entrusted with oversight in parts of Wales and the Marches. These border regions required delicate management. Local lords possessed strong identities and long memories of resistance. Authority there was maintained through negotiation as much as force. The prince's presence in such territories was both symbolic and practical. He held courts to settle disputes. He confirmed charters. He listened to grievances. In these settings, the spectacle of armour gave way to administrative detail. Authority depended on fairness perceived as strength. Meanwhile, England continued to feel the long-term effects of plague. Labour shortages altered traditional obligations. Some peasants sought higher wages or moved between estates. Landowners petitioned the crown for enforcement of wage controls. Tension simmered quietly, though open revolt had not yet emerged. The prince observed these undercurrents, aware that stability required more than victory abroad. Across the Channel, France struggled with internal divisions and financial strain. The French king faced challenges maintaining cohesion among nobles whose loyalty could not be assumed. English commanders recognized opportunity in this instability. Plans formed gradually for renewed campaigns that would extend beyond raiding into strategic assertion. The prince's military education evolved accordingly. He studied maps and reports. He consulted with seasoned captains who had fought in earlier phases of the war. He considered terrain, supply routes, and the limitations of cavalry in certain landscapes. Experience had taught him that adaptability mattered. His personal discipline deepened. Chroniclers noted his seriousness and restraint. He did not indulge excessively in extravagance. While he participated fully in court life, he maintained a measured demeanour. This balance strengthened trust among allies who valued reliability. Religious observance remained central. Before campaigns, prayers were offered collectively. Confession was routine. For a medieval prince, spiritual preparation was inseparable from martial readiness. Success and failure alike were interpreted within theological frameworks. The prince's faith provided continuity in uncertain times. In 1355, preparations intensified for a major expedition into southwestern France. This region, Aquitaine, held particular importance. It had historical ties to the English crown through earlier dynastic arrangements. Control there would not only weaken France but reinforce England's claim to legitimate rule over significant territories. The prince was granted substantial authority for this campaign. This was no longer apprenticeship. He would command with relative independence. Responsibility sharpened attention. Supplies were gathered. Ships were provisioned. Nobles pledged support. Letters were dispatched to secure cooperation from local allies. As forces assembled, England's ports reflected controlled urgency. Sailors loaded equipment. Armour was inspected. Horses were transported carefully. Families gathered to watch departures, aware that absence could be prolonged. War had become a recurring element of national life. Upon arrival in Aquitaine, the prince encountered a region culturally distinct from northern France. The language spoken in marketplaces differed from that of Paris. Local customs reflected southern traditions. Vineyards lined landscapes unfamiliar to English soldiers. Governance here required sensitivity to regional identity. The campaign that followed was marked by movement rather than static siege. The prince led a chevauchée, a mounted raid designed to disrupt enemy resources and provoke engagement. Villages were targeted strategically. Crops were destroyed to undermine supply. Such tactics aimed at compelling the French crown to respond decisively. For the prince, this phase combined logistical coordination with personal leadership. He rode alongside his men, visible and active. He relied on trusted captains to maintain order. Discipline was enforced to prevent fragmentation. Success required cohesion in hostile territory. Ordinary inhabitants of Aquitaine experienced the campaign directly. Farmers saw fields trampled. Towns negotiated to avoid destruction. Some local lords aligned with the English for protection or advantage. Allegiance in medieval Europe could be fluid when survival was at stake. As months passed, the prince's confidence grew. He demonstrated capacity not only for battlefield engagement, but for sustained operation in foreign lands. His name circulated widely. Chroniclers recorded details that enhanced his legend. Yet legend was built on lived complexity, fatigue, calculation, and constant vigilance. By 1356, French forces under King John II moved to confront him near Poitiers. The approaching engagement promised high stakes. Unlike earlier raids, this would bring royal opponents face to face. The prince's army was smaller, but experience had taught him to use terrain and defensive positioning effectively. Before battle, he consulted advisors and prepared formations. The memory of Cressy informed strategy. Archers were positioned advantageously. Ground conditions were assessed. The prince's composure under pressure reassured his men. He had transitioned from promising youth to established commander. The Battle of Poitiers would soon reshape the political landscape. Yet in the days leading to it, uncertainty dominated. Messages moved between camps. Negotiations were considered and dismissed. The prince weighed risk carefully, aware that defeat could reverse years of achievement. In these moments, personal ambition intersected with national expectation. England's hopes rested partly on his decisions. His father's reputation was linked to his performance. The loyalty of allies depended on success. He faced the coming confrontation not as the boy of Cressy, but as a leader shaped by experience, governance, and observation of social currents. His training in tournaments, councils, and regional administration converged in preparation for decisive engagement. History often condenses such moments into a single image of valour. Yet beneath that image lay years of discipline and adaptation. The prince's development had been gradual, structured by environment and reinforced by responsibility. As the armies approached one another near Poitiers, the outcome was uncertain. Victory would elevate his standing beyond dispute. Failure would expose vulnerability. In that suspended moment before conflict, the world seemed balanced between possibility and reversal. The morning near Poitiers did not announce itself with grandeur. It arrived as many mornings did in campaign cool air, low light, men adjusting straps and checking equipment. The prince's army had manoeuvred carefully, seeking ground that would reduce the advantage of superior French numbers. Vineyards and hedges shaped the landscape. Defensive positioning, learned at Cressy, guided arrangement. The political context surrounding this confrontation was tense. France, though strained, remained formidable. King John II had gathered a large force determined to restore prestige and halt English incursions. For him, defeating the English prince would reaffirm authority at home and abroad. For the prince, survival and success would reinforce England's credibility. Negotiations had briefly flickered. Terms were discussed, concessions proposed. Yet pride and calculation narrowed options. Neither side wished to concede too much. Medieval warfare often included such diplomatic interludes, but they did not always prevent combat. The prince's army included English knights, archers, and Gascon allies from Aquitaine. These regional allies were essential. Their familiarity with terrain and local networks strengthened English position. Yet their loyalty was linked to outcomes. Sustained defeat could weaken commitment. In council before battle, the prince considered advice carefully. Experience had taught him that command required listening without surrendering authority. The arrangement adopted placed archers along flanks and in concealed positions. Infantry formed defensive lines. Mobility was preserved where possible. When fighting began, it unfolded in phases. French assaults encountered disciplined resistance. Longbows once again proved effective. Cavalry charges faltered under concentrated arrow fire. The terrain hindered coordinated movement. Confusion spread among advancing ranks. The prince remained visible throughout engagement. Leadership in medieval warfare demanded presence. His armour distinguished him, but also marked him as target. He relied on experienced captains to maintain formation while responding to shifts in momentum. As battle intensified, the French king himself entered the fray. His participation underscored stakes. Royal capture or death carried enormous political consequences. For soldiers on both sides, proximity to such figures heightened urgency. The English position, though under pressure, held. Tactical discipline outweighed numerical disadvantage. Gradually, French cohesion weakened. Captures began to accumulate. Among those taken was King John II. The capture of a reigning monarch was rare and transformative. It altered negotiation dynamics immediately. The prince understood the significance. Securing the king's safety was essential. Ransom practices dictated respectful treatment. Royal prisoners were valuable political assets. After the field quieted, the landscape bore marks of conflict. Discarded weapons, injured men awaiting aid, exhausted survivors assessing outcome. Victory had been decisive. Yet, it carried responsibilities beyond celebration. The prince arranged for King John to be treated with courtesy. Accounts describe him serving the French king at table, a gesture reinforcing chivalric respect. Such actions were not mere theatrics. They communicated strength and adherence to knightly code. Honour extended even to defeated adversaries. News of Poitiers travelled swiftly across Europe. In England, reaction combined pride and astonishment. Capturing the French king elevated the prince's status dramatically. It strengthened negotiating leverage and enhanced national confidence. For France, consequences were severe. Political instability deepened. The king's captivity created leadership vacuum. Financial strain intensified as ransom demands loomed. Peasant unrest and urban disorder would soon follow. The prince returned to Bordeaux with his prisoner, navigating logistics carefully. Guarding a king required vigilance. Negotiations regarding ransom began almost immediately. Terms were complex, involving territorial concessions and immense payments. In Aquitaine, the prince's authority expanded. Victory solidified his legitimacy among local allies. Yet governance of a region far from England posed ongoing challenges. Administration required balancing English interests with local customs. The economic implications of ransom were substantial. Funds expected from France promised relief to England's war financing. However, collection depended on stability within France, which was deteriorating. The prince witnessed how military triumph could generate unforeseen complications. At court in England, celebrations marked the achievement. Edward III's pride in his son was evident. The prince's image now extended beyond national hero to European figure. Diplomats recalibrated strategies in response to shifting power. Yet personal burdens accompanied acclaim. Sustaining reputation required careful conduct. Overconfidence could undermine alliances. The prince remained attentive to counsel, aware that fortune could reverse. Meanwhile, ordinary English subjects experienced mixed effects. War had brought glory, but taxation remained heavy. Labour shortages persisted after plague. Social mobility subtly increased as economic structures adjusted. Success abroad did not eliminate domestic tension. In France, the king's captivity fueled unrest. The Jacquerie, a peasant uprising, erupted amid instability. Urban populations in Paris expressed frustration with noble leadership. The prince observed these developments from Aquitaine, understanding that weakened French cohesion could benefit England strategically. Negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Brétigny in 1360. England secured expanded territories and renounced formal claim to the French crown in exchange for recognition of sovereignty over these lands. The prince's role in shaping these outcomes reinforced his political standing. Peace, however, did not equate to ease. Governing in large territories demanded resources and diplomacy. The prince's responsibilities shifted from campaign command to regional administration on broader scale. In Aquitaine, he established court in Bordeaux. The city's merchants thrived on wine trade. Cultural life differed from England's northern traditions. Language barriers required reliance on local intermediaries. The prince adapted, presiding over ceremonies and hearing petitions. His marriage to Joan of Kent soon followed, a union shaped by affection and controversy. Their relationship would influence his personal and political life deeply. Courtly society watched closely, as marriage among royals carried dynastic significance. For the moment, however, the afterglow of Poitiers defined his standing. He had demonstrated tactical skill and magnanimity. He had captured a king and negotiated advantage. His father's ambitions seemed validated. Yet the very scale of success introduced new complexity. Administering territories required revenue. Taxation in Aquitaine would eventually provoke resistance. Allies who celebrated victory expected benefits. Balancing expectation with capacity became central challenge. The prince's health, still robust, masked vulnerabilities that would emerge later. Campaign hardships had taxed endurance. Exposure to harsh conditions carried consequences not immediately visible. As the 1360s advanced, Europe entered an uneasy peace. Diplomatic exchanges replaced open battle. The prince's role transitioned gradually toward governance and alliance management. Reputation earned in youth would now be tested by patience and restraint. Victory at Poitiers marked a peak. It transformed him from promising commander into central architect of England's continental presence. Yet peaks in history often precede descent not through failure, but through complexity. In the calm after triumph, responsibilities multiplied. The prince faced a future less defined by immediate combat and more by sustained leadership. And the measure of a life shaped by war would increasingly depend on how it navigated peace. Peace did not arrive with celebration alone. It arrived with ledgers, petitions, and expectations. After the Treaty of Brétigny, the prince stood at the centre of a new reality. England had secured expanded lands in Aquitaine, and he was entrusted with governing them. Victory at Poitiers had elevated him beyond question as a military leader. Now he was expected to prove himself as a ruler in fact. Not only in reputation, Bordeaux became the heart of his authority. The city, prosperous from wine trade, differed from English urban centres. Its merchants were accustomed to autonomy. Its language carried softer rhythms than those of London. The prince presided over ceremonies in halls lined with stone arches, listening to disputes over land, trade, and feudal obligations. Governance required patience. Each petition revealed local complexities unfamiliar to a prince raised in England's court. The political climate in Aquitaine was layered. Some nobles welcomed English oversight, seeing advantage in alignment with a powerful foreign prince. Others complied outwardly while preserving private reservations. Loyalty was often pragmatic. The prince recognized that force alone could not secure allegiance. Stability required accommodation of regional customs and privileges. He maintained a visible court, combining English formality with Gascon participation. Banquets reinforced alliances. Judicial hearings displayed fairness. He confirmed charters to reassure towns that their rights would be respected. Yet the costs of maintaining such a court were substantial. Retainers required payment, infrastructure demanded upkeep. Military readiness could not be neglected entirely. Economically, the region depended heavily on trade. Wine exports to England formed a vital connection. Merchants sought predictable taxation and safe routes. The prince's administration aimed to preserve this flow. However, the financial demands inherited from prolonged war created pressure. England still required funds, and Aquitaine was expected to contribute. His marriage to Joan of Kent deepened his personal life within this new setting. Joan was not an uncontroversial figure. Her earlier marital entanglements had stirred dispute, yet she possessed resilience and intelligence. Their union brought companionship and also political calculation. As princess, she adapted to life abroad, hosting gatherings and reinforcing courtly presence. Within their household, daily routines blended ceremony with intimacy. Mornings might begin with prayer, followed by administrative consultations. Meals were structured, but also occasions for private conversation. Chroniclers often focus on public acts, yet domestic rhythms sustained balance amid responsibility. The prince's character during these years revealed steadiness rather than flamboyance. He did not govern through spectacle alone. Records indicate careful attention to petitions and disputes. He sought to project justice, understanding that fairness cultivated loyalty more effectively than intimidation. Yet financial strain intensified gradually. The costs of maintaining authority in Aquitaine, combined with obligations to England, required revenue. Taxes were levied to fund defence and administration. Local populations, already sensitive to burdens imposed by previous conflicts, began to express discontent. Across Europe, peace remained fragile. France struggled internally. King John II's ransom obligations weighed heavily. Political factions manoeuvred for influence. While overt hostilities paused, distrust lingered. The prince monitored developments, aware that renewed conflict could erupt. Social tensions in Aquitaine manifested differently from those in England. Urban elites defended commercial privileges. Rural communities balanced feudal duties with emerging economic leverage after the demographic losses of plague. The prince's officials navigated this landscape, enforcing taxation while attempting to prevent open unrest. In England, the crown continued to rely on parliamentary cooperation for funding. The prince's successes had strengthened national pride, yet expectations of prosperity were high. Merchants hoped territorial gains would secure stable trade. Nobles anticipated rewards proportionate to service. The prince's health during this period appeared stable, though campaigns in harsh climates had left unseen effects. Leadership demanded travel across territories, attendance at councils, and readiness to respond to disputes. Fatigue was managed quietly. Medieval standards of endurance did not encourage complaint. The cultural life of Bordeaux flourished under his presence. Musicians, poets, and clerics contributed to court atmosphere. Tournaments were held occasionally, blending local and English traditions. These events reinforced identity while maintaining martial readiness. However, Governance grew more complex when disputes arose between Aquitaine and France regarding interpretation of treaty terms. Questions over feudal obligations surfaced. The French crown asserted rights of appeal over certain Gascon lords, challenging English sovereignty. Legal arguments replaced open warfare but carried similar stakes. The prince faced a choice: concede limited appeals to preserve peace or resist firmly to protect authority. He leaned toward firmness. Allowing French intervention risked undermining the autonomy secured by treaty. His decision reflected commitment to England's territorial claim but increased tension. Economic pressure deepened when he undertook intervention in Castile to support Peter of Castile against rival claimants. This campaign, though aligned with broader strategic interests, required substantial funding. Aquitaine was expected to supply resources for a venture that many locals did not see as directly beneficial. The Castillian expedition in 1367 initially succeeded at the Battle of Nájera. The prince demonstrated once again tactical skill, yet the financial returns anticipated from supporting Peter did not materialize as expected. Promised payments were delayed or insufficient. The burden fell back upon Aquitaine's treasury. Upon return, the prince's administration confronted growing dissatisfaction. Taxes levied to cover campaign expenses provoked resistance among Gascon nobles and towns. Complaints reached the French crown, which saw opportunity to challenge English rule legally. Here, the environment that had shaped his earlier triumph began to shift. Military prowess could not easily resolve disputes framed as legal appeals. The French king declared that he retained sovereignty rights, allowing Gascon nobles to seek redress. The prince's refusal to recognize this jurisdiction escalated tensions. Within Aquitaine, loyalty frayed. Some lords reconsidered alignment. Merchants worried that instability would disrupt trade. The prince, accustomed to decisive action on battlefield, faced slower, more intricate conflict of administration and diplomacy. His personal demeanor during these challenges remained composed. Chroniclers describe him as resolute rather than impulsive. He continued to hold court, to review petitions, to reinforce alliances where possible. Yet the strain was evident in the increasing complexity of correspondence and negotiation. Social conditions in the region reflected wider European uncertainty. Labour patterns shifted, markets fluctuated. Religious devotion remained strong, with churches central to community life. People sought stability amid political manoeuvring beyond their direct control. As 1369 approached, France declared the Treaty of Brétigny void, citing English violations. Open war resumed. Aquitaine became contested ground once more. The prince's earlier victories no longer guaranteed advantage. Resources were stretched. Local support was uneven. Illness began to affect him during this period, likely contracted during the Castillian campaign. Symptoms limited endurance. Travel became more taxing. Yet he persisted in attempting to manage defense and administration simultaneously. The cost of glory, once measured in battlefield risk, now appeared in administrative fatigue and physical decline. Leadership under such conditions required delegation. Trusted captains assumed greater operational roles. Authority, though still centred in him, dispersed gradually. In England, observers noted renewed conflict with concern. The prince's health reports reached court. His father, aging but still king, faced the reality that his heir's vigour might not be inexhaustible. Aquitaine's unrest did not erupt suddenly, but eroded stability incrementally. Appeals to the French crown multiplied. Towns shifted allegiance strategically. The prince's position, once secured by Poitiers, required constant reinforcement. These years demonstrated a different dimension of his character. He did not abandon responsibility despite illness and resistance. He remained engaged, issuing directives and coordinating defense. Yet the limits of personal control became clearer. By 1371, it was evident that governance in Aquitaine could not continue under such strain. His health deteriorated further. Strategic advantage diminished. Reluctantly, arrangements were made for his return to England. The departure from Bordeaux marked the end of a chapter defined by ambition and difficulty. He left behind territories whose loyalty was uncertain and whose future would soon be contested without his direct oversight. The prince who had captured a king now confronted a quieter challenge, the acceptance that strength has limits. His legacy in Aquitaine would be debated. Some would recall fairness and valour, others would remember taxation and unrest. Peace had demanded more than triumph could easily supply, and in that demand, the prince encountered the reality that governing a fragile realm was often more complex than winning a battle. When the prince returned to England, the contrast between Bordeaux's strained administration and the familiar rhythm of the royal court was marked but not comforting. He did not come home in triumph. He came back diminished in strength, carrying the weight of unfinished work. Aquitaine, once secured by treaty and reputation, was again unstable. War with France had resumed in earnest. His body, once resilient, now imposed limits that no discipline could overcome. England itself had changed during his absence. The memory of plague still shaped demographic patterns. Labour remained scarce in some regions, and disputes between landowners and workers continued to simmer. Parliament had grown more assertive in matters of taxation and governance. Merchants were cautious, aware that renewed war threatened trade routes. The prince stepped into a kingdom proud of its victories, yet uneasy about its future. His father, Edward III, was ageing. The king who had once embodied energetic ambition now faced the reality of decline. Court factions grew more visible. Ambitious courtiers sought influence over policy and succession. The prince's presence altered this dynamic. As heir, his authority was recognised, yet his health raised quiet concern. He took up residence primarily at Kennington and occasionally at Westminster, participating in councils when able. Illness did not remove him from responsibility, but it required careful pacing. Chroniclers describe periods of weakness, alternating with moments of renewed engagement. Medieval medicine offered limited remedies. Physicians prescribed rest, dietary adjustments, and prayer. No cure could reverse underlying deterioration. In council sessions, he contributed measured judgment. Experience in Aquitaine had deepened his understanding of governance under strain. He advocated firmness toward France, but recognized financial constraints. War required resources that England could not generate indefinitely without social cost. Meanwhile, conflict abroad intensified. French forces regained territories previously secured. English garrisons struggled to maintain positions without unified command. The prince, once central to continental strategy, now observed from afar as others carried forward campaigns. His relationship with his younger brother, John of Gaunt, became increasingly significant. John assumed greater military and political responsibility. Their cooperation was essential for stability. Though differing in temperament, they shared commitment to dynastic continuity. The prince's earlier experiences in Aquitaine informed counsel offered to his brother. Domestic tensions also demanded attention. In 1376, Parliament convened in what became known as the Good Parliament. It sought to address corruption and financial mismanagement within the royal administration. Criticism targeted influential courtiers close to the aging king. The prince supported some reform efforts, aligning with calls for accountability. This alignment revealed another dimension of his character. He was not merely a warrior but a participant in institutional development. By endorsing reform, he signaled recognition that authority required trust. Yet these actions also intensified factional resistance. Within his household, Joan of Kent provided continuity. Their marriage, once shaped by controversy, had matured into partnership. She managed domestic affairs and maintained courtly presence. Their sons Edward of Angoulême and Richard represented hope for succession. The death of the elder son in childhood had already struck deeply. Richard remained as fragile symbol of future stability. The prince's interactions with young Richard were attentive. Conscious of his own declining strength, he invested time in ensuring his son's education. Tutors instructed the boy in languages, scripture, and courtly conduct. The prince's guidance emphasized discipline and awareness of responsibility. He understood the vulnerability of a child heir in turbulent political climate. Daily life in England during these years combined normalcy with underlying anxiety. Markets functioned, harvests were gathered, church bells rang as always. Yet war expenses weighed heavily. Taxes were debated intensely. News from France brought alternating reports of skirmishes and setbacks. The prince's health constrained public appearances. When he attended ceremonies, observers noted his physical frailty contrasted with earlier vigour. Armour no longer fit comfortably. Participation in tournaments ceased entirely. Leadership shifted from battlefield to chamber. Despite decline, his reputation remained formidable. Foreign envoys treated him with respect rooted in memory of Cressy and Poitiers. Even adversaries acknowledged his past achievements. Yet reputation could not compensate for absent command in renewed campaigns. As 1376 progressed, it became clear that he would not ascend the throne. His father still reigned, but the prince's illness advanced steadily. Awareness of mortality influenced decisions. He focused on securing recognition of Richard as legitimate heir. Political climate grew tense around succession. Court factions manoeuvred subtly. Some questioned stability of placing a child on the throne should the prince die before the king. The prince worked to consolidate support among nobles and parliamentarians. His influence, though weakened physically, remained persuasive. Religious devotion deepened in these final years. Confession and mass occupied significant portions of his routine. Illness sharpened reflection. Medieval worldview interpreted suffering within spiritual context. Acceptance of limitation did not eliminate frustration, but it framed endurance. In June 1376, after prolonged illness, Edward the Black Prince died at Westminster, preceding his father by less than a year. He was 45. His death altered England's trajectory immediately. The heir apparent was now a boy of 9. Funeral arrangements reflected his status. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, near the shrine of Thomas Becket. His armour, shield, and gauntlets were displayed above his tomb, symbols of a life defined by warfare and duty. The choice of burial site connected him to national religious identity and royal tradition. The kingdom entered a delicate phase. Edward III died in 1377, and Richard II ascended the throne as child king. Governance shifted to regency councils. The absence of the Black Prince's steady presence was felt in both court and countryside. Legacy began to crystallize even as consequences unfolded. Chroniclers praised his courage and courtesy. Stories of Poitiers circulated widely. His administrative challenges in Aquitaine received less attention in celebratory narratives. Memory favored battlefield clarity over fiscal complexity. Yet history rarely rests on single dimension. The prince's life embodied both triumph and strain. He had expanded England's influence, but also faced limits of sustained control. He had supported institutional reform, yet could not secure long-term peace. For ordinary people, his death was a distant event, yet symbolically important. A prince who had represented strength was gone. Stability now depended on a child navigating court intrigue and national expectation. In private chambers before his death, he is said to have expressed concern for Richard's future. Whether recorded exactly or shaped by later reflection, such accounts suggest awareness of fragility inherent in succession. The armour hanging above his tomb remains tangible reminder of a life lived within expectations of chivalry and command. It speaks silently of youth on horseback, of councils under candlelight, of illness born without spectacle. He never wore the English crown. His father's ambitions shaped his path, yet destiny withheld final step. In that absence lies one of history's quiet turning points. What might have unfolded had he lived to reign? The question lingers without answer. His achievements are clear, his unrealized potential remains speculative. In the end, he was both product and shaper of his century, a warrior educated in discipline, a governor challenged by complexity, a father concerned for continuity. History records his victories with certainty. It records his struggles with less emphasis. But perhaps the measure of his life rests not only in triumph or decline, but in the recognition that even the most celebrated figures are bound by limits. After his death, the prince's presence did not vanish from England's political life. It altered its form. Memory became influence. The armour suspended above his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral was not merely ceremonial display. It was a reminder to courtiers and common visitors alike of a standard once embodied in living form. Richard II, now king at 9 years old, grew up beneath that shadow. The early years of Richard's reign unfolded under regency councils dominated by powerful nobles, including John of Gaunt. The absence of the Black Prince's mature authority created space for factional competition. England remained at war with France. Campaigns continued, but coordination lacked the clarity once associated with his leadership. Military operations were conducted, yet victories were incremental rather than decisive. Social tensions that had simmered since the plague years intensified in this new climate. The crown's need for revenue did not diminish with a child king. Taxes were levied repeatedly to fund war efforts. Among these were poll taxes that fell heavily on common people. Rural communities, already navigating altered labour relationships, experienced strain that translated into resentment. In 1381, 5 years after the prince's death, the peasants' revolt erupted. Though he was not alive to witness it, the uprising occurred within structures shaped partly by his generation's policies. Labour statutes, taxation for war, and the long aftermath of plague converged into open protest. Rebels marched toward London demanding reform and relief. Richard II, still a youth, confronted the crisis directly. His decision to meet rebels personally revealed both courage and vulnerability. Observers could not help but compare the young king's actions with memories of his father's composed command. The revolt was suppressed, but its occurrence exposed fragility within English society. The prince's legacy during these years was invoked selectively. Supporters of strong martial leadership recalled Cressy and Poitiers as models of decisive action. Advocates of reform pointed to his support for the good parliament as evidence that authority could align with accountability. His life provided material for differing interpretations. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France gradually regained territories lost during earlier phases of war. English positions weakened through attrition and shifting alliances. The expansive vision secured at Brétigny contracted steadily. Without the prince's leadership, strategic coherence diminished. In Aquitaine, English authority eroded. Gascon loyalty wavered as French forces applied sustained pressure. Towns that once hosted the prince's court recalibrated allegiance according to survival. His administrative efforts, though earnest, could not withstand absence of direct oversight combined with renewed French determination. Within England's aristocracy, chivalric culture persisted. Tournaments continued. The Order of the Garter remained prestigious, yet the romantic image of warfare confronted economic reality. Sustained conflict without clear gains tested patience. Merchants grew cautious about financing ventures with uncertain returns. Richard II's personality developed within this environment. Educated carefully and exposed to ceremonial expectation, he cultivated refinement and a strong sense of royal dignity. However, he lacked his father's battlefield experience. His authority rested more on symbolism than on demonstrated military command. As Richard matured, tensions between him and powerful nobles intensified. Questions of governance style, favoritism, and fiscal policy emerged. Some critics suggested that had the Black Prince lived to rule, stability might have endured differently. Such comparisons, though speculative, influenced political discourse. The prince's widow, Joan of Kent, remained an important figure at court until her death in 1385. Her presence provided continuity between generations. She carried memory of her husband into advisory roles, though her influence gradually receded as Richard asserted independence. Religious life in England during these decades also shifted subtly. Movements associated with John Wycliffe questioned certain church practices, reflecting broader currents of reform and intellectual inquiry. Social strain and war fatigue contributed to receptiveness toward new ideas. The prince had lived within firmly orthodox frameworks. The next generation encountered more visible dissent. Economic adjustments continued as labour markets stabilised unevenly. Urban centres expanded gradually. Trade networks adapted to political fluctuations. While England remained predominantly rural, gradual diversification altered local economies. The prince's tomb in Canterbury attracted visitors not only for piety but for reflection. Pilgrims travelling to the shrine of Thomas Becket observed his effigy in armour. Hands joined in prayer. The inscription emphasised his martial achievements and noble lineage. Memory was curated carefully, highlighting virtues consistent with chivalric ideals. Over time, the sobriquet Black Prince became more widely used. Whether derived from armour coloration or later romanticisation, it contributed to distinct identity. Names shape legacy. The title suggested severity and strength, reinforcing martial narrative. Historians in subsequent centuries interpreted his life according to evolving values. Some portrayed him as ideal knight, embodiment of medieval honour. Others examined administrative difficulties in Aquitaine as evidence of overextension. Both perspectives draw from same life, yet emphasise different elements. In England's political evolution, his support for parliamentary reform during the Good Parliament is sometimes cited as early recognition of accountability. Yet, he remained fundamentally committed to dynastic authority. His actions reflect a balance between institutional stability and royal prerogative. As Richard II's reign progressed, internal conflict deepened. Factional struggles culminated in the eventual deposition of Richard in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. The Lancastrian accession marked another turning point in English monarchy. The line descending from the Black Prince ended with Richard's removal and death. Thus, the prince's direct dynastic legacy was short-lived. His son's reign did not secure long-term stability. The martial glory of earlier decades did not translate into enduring continental dominance. Yet influence is not measured solely by duration of lineage. The prince's campaigns contributed to transformation of English military identity. Reliance on disciplined infantry and longbowmen reshaped European warfare. His victories demonstrated effectiveness of tactical adaptation against numerically superior forces. Culturally, his life reinforced ideals of chivalric conduct. Courtesy toward captured King John at Poitiers became emblematic of knightly restraint. Such stories circulated widely, shaping expectations of noble behaviour. In France, memory of his campaigns lingered differently. To some, he represented formidable adversary. To others, his raids and taxation in Aquitaine symbolised hardship imposed by foreign rule. Legacy varies according to vantage point. The broader arc of the 100 Years' War extended long beyond his lifetime. Generations would continue struggle with fluctuating fortunes. His role belongs to its earlier, dramatic phase when English expansion seemed plausible and momentum favoured his father's vision. When considering his life in full, one observes patterns shaped by environment as much as by choice. Born into ambition, trained for combat, elevated by victory, constrained by illness, and denied kingship by timing, he navigated conditions largely predetermined. Daily life for ordinary people during his era remained grounded in harvest cycles, parish rituals, and localized concerns. Yet distant decisions influenced their taxation and security. His campaigns affected markets, labour, and allegiance far beyond battlefield. In examining his character, one sees consistency in discipline and resolve. He did not govern through cruelty, nor through indulgence. His failures arose more from structural pressures than from neglect. History often elevates moments of triumph while compressing complexity. The prince's narrative invites broader view. Victory at Poitiers cannot be separated from financial strain that followed. Administrative determination cannot be separated from resistance encountered. As centuries passed, romantic portrayals emphasized gleaming armor and noble gesture. Modern scholarship seeks balance, acknowledging both achievement and limitation. Between those interpretations lies a human figure shaped by expectation and constrained by mortality. If he had lived longer, would England's path have differed? If Aquitaine had been governed with lighter taxation, would loyalty have endured? Such questions remain open, inviting reflection rather than conclusion. His life, like many in turbulent centuries, reflects interplay between ambition and circumstance. He advanced England's claims, yet could not secure them permanently. He prepared his son carefully, yet could not protect him from political upheaval. Centuries passed, yet the figure of Edward of Woodstock did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he settled into England's historical imagination in a particular way, clear in outline, selective in detail. Chroniclers of the later Middle Ages had already shaped the foundations of his memory. They wrote for audiences who valued courage and piety, and they emphasized those traits accordingly. Over time, the Black Prince became less a complicated governor of Aquitaine and more an emblem of chivalric virtue. In the 15th century, as the 100 Years' War continued in new phases under different kings, earlier victories acquired renewed importance. Agincourt, fought under Henry V, echoed Cressy and Poitiers in both strategy and scale of triumph against odds. Observers drew comparisons, consciously or not, between the Black Prince and later warrior kings. Tactical reliance on archers became a defining feature of English martial identity. His campaigns thus contributed to a broader tradition that extended beyond his own life. At the same time, France rebuilt itself. Under leaders such as Charles V, administrative reform and strategic patience gradually reversed English territorial gains. The earlier image of English dominance gave way to protracted attrition. By the mid-15th century, England's continental possessions had largely vanished. Aquitaine, once governed from Bordeaux under the prince's oversight, returned to French control permanently. The expansive vision secured at Brétigny proved temporary. This shift inevitably reframed his legacy. If the territories he fought to secure did not endure under English rule, what then remained of his achievement? For some, the answer lay in the example rather than the outcome. He represented a period when English arms had seemed nearly unstoppable. His life marked a high point in confidence. Within England's internal politics, the later Wars of the Roses complicated dynastic narratives. Competing houses traced legitimacy through different branches of Edward III's lineage. The Black Prince's line had ended with Richard II's deposition, but his blood remained part of royal heritage. Political arguments sometimes invoked ancestry connected to him as symbolic reinforcement. In cultural memory, effigies and chronicles preserved his image carefully. The armour above his tomb remained one of the earliest surviving examples of medieval plate displayed in situ. Pilgrims and later visitors saw not only a monument, but a story suspended in metal. The physicality of that display reinforced continuity between past and present. Early modern historians, writing in the 16th and 17th centuries, approached his life through lenses shaped by their own concerns. Some admired his military skill as evidence of national greatness. Others, attentive to emerging concepts of statecraft, evaluated his governance in Aquitaine more critically. Yet few ignored him entirely. His presence within Edward III's reign was too central. By the 18th and 19th centuries, romantic fascination with medieval chivalry transformed his image further. Writers and artists portrayed him as ideal knight, often smoothing complexities of taxation disputes and administrative strain. Paintings depicted moments of generosity toward King John II, emphasizing courtesy. The sobriquet Black Prince took on dramatic resonance, aligning with tastes for heroic narrative. Victorian Britain, engaged in its own imperial expansion, sometimes looked back to medieval campaigns as early expressions of outward ambition. The The prince's victories could be interpreted as antecedents to later global endeavours, yet such readings risked imposing modern frameworks upon medieval realities. His world was defined less by empire in modern sense than by dynastic claim and feudal obligation. 20th century scholarship introduced greater nuance. Historians examined fiscal records from Aquitaine, correspondence related to Castile, and parliamentary proceedings in England. The Black Prince emerged as figure both capable and constrained. His administrative difficulties were analysed within broader economic context. His illness, perhaps dysentery contracted in Spain, was considered in assessing later decisions. Modern readers encounter a more layered portrait. He was neither flawless paragon nor reckless aggressor. He was a man trained from childhood for warfare, who excelled in combat yet faced structural limits in governance. His refusal to submit Gascon appeals to French jurisdiction, for example, can be interpreted as principled defence of sovereignty or as inflexible adherence to pride. Interpretation depends partly on perspective. Beyond scholarly debate, public memory continues to gravitate toward vivid episodes. Cressy and Poitiers remain touchstones. The courtesy shown to captured king endures in popular retellings. The fact that he never became king adds an element of pathos to narrative arc. Unfulfilled kingship invites speculation. In England today, his name survives in institutions, streets, and public houses. Military units have invoked his example historically. His tomb in Canterbury remains site of quiet reflection, less frequented than Becket's shrine once was, yet still resonant for those who pause. Considering his life in totality reveals tension between agency and circumstance. Born heir to ambitious monarch, he fulfilled martial expectation brilliantly. Entrusted with governance, he encountered economic and diplomatic resistance beyond simple resolution. Struck by illness, he faced mortality earlier than anticipated. He prepared his son for succession, yet could not shield him from turbulent reign. The broader 14th century, shaped by plague, war, and shifting social order, framed each of these experiences. No prince, however skilled, operated independently of such forces. The demographic shock of the Black Death altered labour relations permanently. War financing reshaped parliamentary involvement. Regional identities complicated territorial control. Within this environment, even decisive victory offered only temporary stability. If one imagines standing in Bordeaux during his tenure, observing merchants debating taxation, nobles weighing allegiance, and clerics praying for peace, the prince appears not as distant legend, but as administrator navigating pressure. If one imagines the field near Poitiers, dust rising under hooves, arrows falling with precision, and a king taken captive, he appears as commander at peak of clarity. These scenes coexist within a single life. They resist reduction to simple moral. They invite patient consideration. His contemporaries likely saw him through immediate concerns: security, revenue, loyalty. They did not know how long the war would last or how later generations would judge. They responded to present necessity. Perhaps that is the most consistent thread in his story. Decisions were shaped less by abstract destiny than by conditions pressing in from every side. Honour mattered, but so did supply lines. Faith mattered, but so did finances. Courage mattered, but so did health. If one steps back from individual episodes and considers the broader arc of Edward of Woodstock's life, another dimension becomes visible: the way his career illuminates the transformation of medieval kingship itself. He was born into a system still deeply feudal in structure, yet by the time of his death, England had begun to move, cautiously and unevenly, toward a more centralized political culture. His experiences sit precisely at that hinge. In his youth, authority was expressed primarily through personal presence. A king or prince demonstrated legitimacy on horseback, in armour, surrounded by banners. Loyalty flowed from oaths sworn face to face. Victory confirmed hierarchy. In such a world, his success at Cressy and Poitiers did more than win battles. It reinforced the logic of rule itself. If a prince could defeat a king in open combat and treat him with visible magnanimity, then that prince embodied the martial competence expected of sovereignty. Yet, as the years advanced, governance proved less dependent on battlefield charisma and more on administration, revenue, and negotiation. The prince's difficulties in Aquitaine reveal this shift. Territorial control required consistent taxation, legal clarity, and sensitivity to local privilege. In that realm, visible courage mattered less than durable institutional trust. One may consider the chevauché strategy he employed in France. It was effective in short-term disruption and in compelling confrontation. It demonstrated mobility and discipline, but it also inflicted hardship on rural populations. For English soldiers, it meant strategic advantage. For French peasants, it meant burned fields and insecurity. War was experienced differently depending on one's position within the hierarchy. The prince likely understood this distinction, even if he accepted it as necessary. Medieval warfare did not separate civilian and military life in the way later centuries attempted. Economic warfare was integrated into strategy. Crops were targets because they sustained armies. Towns negotiated surrender to avoid destruction. These realities formed the environment in which he operated. His courtesy toward King John II at Poitiers has often been cited as evidence of knightly virtue. It is worth reflecting on what such courtesy signified. It reinforced shared aristocratic identity that transcended national boundaries. Kings and princes might contest territory, but they also belonged to common culture of chivalry. Respect for rank preserved a certain continuity even amid conflict. That continuity, however, did not extend to lower classes. The peasant who suffered from raids in Aquitaine or northern France did not share in the chivalric fraternity. For them, warfare was hardship imposed from above. The prince's life thus highlights tension between elite ideals and broader social experience. His illness introduces yet another perspective. In an age without modern medical knowledge, disease could interrupt even the most carefully constructed plans. The likely dysentery contracted during the Castillian campaign weakened him gradually. His body became a reminder that leadership was vulnerable. Medieval chroniclers often interpreted illness spiritually, yet practical consequence was undeniable. Strategic continuity depended on physical endurance. Had he remained healthy, might the renewed phase of the 100 Years' War have unfolded differently? It is impossible to know. His absence in later campaigns deprived England of experienced commander at critical juncture. Yet structural pressures, financial strain, French administrative reform under Charles V, and internal English tensions would still have existed. His relationship with Parliament during the Good Parliament of 1376 suggests awareness that monarchy required cooperation with representative bodies. By supporting reform measures, he acknowledged dissatisfaction within political class. That gesture did not revolutionize governance, but it indicated sensitivity to legitimacy beyond lineage. Richard II inherited not only crown, but accumulated complexity. The prince's guidance during Richard's childhood attempted to prepare him for responsibility, yet preparation could not replicate lived experience of war. When Richard faced rebellion in 1381, he confronted challenges shaped by decades of policy decisions extending back to Edward III's reigns. From modern vantage point, the Black Prince's life can be seen as both culmination and transition. He embodied high chivalric culture of 14th century, yet his administrative struggles foreshadowed increasing importance of bureaucratic governance. He operated within feudal framework, yet participated in early parliamentary accountability. Culturally, his story contributed to England's evolving sense of national identity. Victory against France fostered pride that transcended local allegiances. Songs and chronicles celebrated not only individual heroism, but collective achievement. The longbow became symbol of English ingenuity. Such symbols endure beyond specific campaigns. In France, the memory of his raids informed later determination to reorganize military and fiscal systems. Charles V's reforms emphasized disciplined standing forces and centralized revenue collection. In this indirect way, the prince's successes prompted adaptation in adversary state. Thus, his life intersects with broader European transformation. Warfare became less dependent on feudal levies and more on sustained financial structures. Monarchies began to require more consistent taxation and administrative oversight. These developments were not caused by him alone, but he participated actively in their unfolding. If we imagine him walking through the halls of Bordeaux, listening to Gascon lords argue their appeals, we see a man confronting realities that did not yield to lance or arrow. If we imagine him in Westminster, weakened yet advising on reform, we see a leader aware that power required consent as well as command. The fact that he never reigned adds poignancy but also clarity. Without the burden of kingship, his life stands as concentrated episode within larger reign. We can observe potential without conflating it entirely with outcome. He is remembered for what he accomplished, not for prolonged governance marked by compromise. His burial in Canterbury placed him within spiritual and national narrative. The proximity to Thomas Becket's shrine linked martial life with sacred continuity. Pilgrims moving through cathedral space encountered both martyrdom and military valour. Medieval England did not separate sacred and secular domains sharply. They coexisted within shared architecture. Over time, layers of interpretation accumulated. Romantic writers emphasized knightly honour. Modern historians examine fiscal ledgers. Each generation projects concerns onto his story. Yet beneath interpretation remains a life structured by discipline, ambition, illness, and incomplete succession. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of his legacy lies in balance. He neither achieved permanent territorial dominance nor presided over catastrophic defeat. He experienced both ascent and limitation. His era, shaped by plague and war, demanded resilience from all levels of society. For the ordinary villager in England or Aquitaine, his name might have been distant yet consequential. Taxes, levies, and news of campaigns linked daily bread to decisions made in council chambers. Leadership in medieval context rippled outward into fields and marketplaces. When later generations attempted to measure Edward of Woodstock, they often did so by isolating moments: the boy at Cressy, the commander at Poitiers, the invalid prince advising Parliament. Yet a life lived across 45 years cannot be reduced to its brightest or most fragile scenes. To understand him more fully, one must return again to the texture of his daily existence, to the habits that sustained him and the assumptions that framed his choices. He grew up in a world where hierarchy was visible in architecture. Castles rose above towns not only for defence but for statement. Stone walls communicated permanence. Within those walls, corridors echoed with footsteps of retainers carrying messages and meals. The prince learned early that authority required presence in such spaces. To sit at the high table was not mere privilege, it was affirmation of order. Meals in noble households followed predictable structure: bread trencher, roasted meats, stewed vegetables, wine or ale. These were staples of aristocratic diet. Fasting days regulated consumption, according to church calendar. The prince's body was sustained by abundance compared to most subjects, yet discipline remained essential. Overindulgence could weaken reputation. Clothing, too, communicated status. Fine wool, silk imported through trade routes, embroidery bearing heraldic symbols, all reinforced identity. Armour was both protection and proclamation. When he donned his surcoat, displaying the royal lions of England, quartered with French fleurs-de-lis, he wore dynastic claim visibly upon his chest. Education in such environment combined scripture with strategy. Latin texts shaped understanding of history and theology. Chronicles of earlier kings offered precedent. The prince likely absorbed stories of Edward I's campaigns in Wales and Scotland, internalizing expectation that conquest affirmed legitimacy. Historical memory guided contemporary ambition. His relationship with his father deserves particular attention. Edward III was charismatic, ambitious, and attentive to spectacle. The prince inherited not only claim but example. From his father he learned that public display tournaments, feasts, ceremonies strengthened loyalty. Yet he also witnessed cost of prolonged war, the constant need to negotiate funding through parliament and merchants. Their dynamic appears to have been one of mutual respect. The king entrusted his son with independent command at relatively young age, signalling confidence. At Cressy, whether the famous refusal to reinforce him unfolded exactly as chroniclers later described, the underlying principle was clear. The prince must prove himself publicly. Such testing was harsh but formative. In Aquitaine, away from his father's immediate supervision, he exercised authority more autonomously. There, his habits of consultation deepened. He relied on experienced administrators to interpret local law. He balanced English expectations with Gascon tradition. That balancing act required attentiveness to nuance, a skill distinct from battlefield decisiveness. The tension between central authority and regional autonomy is visible throughout his governance. Aquitaine was not blank canvas. It possessed its own nobility, customs, and economic networks. To impose uniform policy without regard for these realities would provoke resistance. Yet to concede too much risked undermining sovereignty secured by treaty. The Castillian expedition illustrates another layer of complexity. Intervention abroad aligned with broader strategic interests, preventing French influence in Iberia and strengthening alliances. However, the promised financial support from Peter of Castile proved unreliable. When anticipated reimbursement failed, the burden shifted to Aquitaine's treasury. Taxation increased. Discontent followed. Here one sees interplay between ambition and constraint. The prince pursued strategic advantage, yet miscalculation regarding payment exposed his administration to strain. Such miscalculation was not uncommon in medieval alliances, where promises were shaped by shifting fortunes. Nonetheless, consequences were tangible. His illness during and after this campaign altered trajectory sharply. Chronic conditions limited energy. Chroniclers describe him weakened, sometimes carried rather than walking. For man accustomed to active command, such limitation must have been difficult. Medieval notions of masculinity tied vigour to authority. Endurance under illness therefore required quiet resilience. Within his household, Joan of Kent provided stability. Her earlier life, marked by disputed marriage and complex legal battles, had prepared her for navigating court politics. She managed domestic affairs and maintained a network of relationships that supported her husband's position. Their partnership reveals dimension of medieval rulership often overlooked: governance as family enterprise. Their surviving son, Richard, became focal point of future planning. The prince's awareness of mortality likely intensified attention to Richard's education. Tutors emphasized languages, diplomacy, and ceremonial awareness. Yet no training could substitute for lived experience of command in war. In the wider society of England, religious observance structured everyday existence. Parish churches served as centres of community. Confession, feast days, and pilgrimages punctuated life. The prince participated in these rhythms, contributing donations and patronage. His burial at Canterbury reflects both personal devotion and dynastic symbolism. Economic life in England during his adulthood showed gradual diversification. Towns such as London, York, and Bristol expanded commercial activity. Guilds regulated craft production. Wool exports remained central to national revenue. War influenced these patterns by disrupting trade and necessitating naval protection. The relationship between Crown and Parliament evolved during his lifetime. Financial necessity required consultation with representatives of shires and towns. While ultimate authority rested with King, the process of negotiation created precedent for participation. The prince's support for reform in 1376 suggests recognition that sustainable governance required legitimacy beyond hereditary claim. Across Europe, the 14th century experienced intellectual and cultural shifts. Universities expanded influence. Scholastic debates addressed theology and philosophy. Though primarily associated with clerical circles, such currents shaped broader intellectual climate in which rulers operated. The prince's education would have included exposure to these discussions, at least indirectly. The 100 Years' War itself transformed military practice. Emphasis on disciplined infantry and archery signalled shift from dominance of heavy cavalry alone. The prince's successes validated tactical flexibility. Future commanders studied these engagements carefully. Yet military innovation did not guarantee political permanence. France's administrative reforms under Charles V reorganized taxation and army recruitment, gradually offsetting earlier disadvantages. Structural adaptation proved decisive over time. If one imagines the prince in final months of life, weakened yet attentive to council discussions, one sees continuity between youth and maturity. Discipline acquired in childhood persisted. Responsibility remained central. He did not withdraw into isolation but engaged as strength allowed. His death before his father's created immediate succession challenge. Richard II's minority required regency. Factional disputes emerged. The Black Prince's potential reign remains hypothetical, yet his absence undeniably altered course of English politics. Memory often simplifies such contingencies. We may be tempted to imagine that had he lived, stability would have endured uninterrupted. Yet history suggests that structural pressures would still have required navigation. His talents might have mitigated conflict, but not eliminated complexity inherent in governing kingdom, recovering from plague and engaged in prolonged war. Ultimately, Edward of Woodstock's life illustrates interplay between individual capability and historical environment. He achieved remarkable victories within conditions that later constrained gains. He embodied chivalric ideal while confronting fiscal and administrative realities. His story invites reflection not only on heroism, but on limits of power. Authority, even when brilliantly exercised, remains subject to health, economy, and time. When historians look at the 14th century as a whole, they often describe it as an age of strain. War stretched across decades. Disease reduced populations dramatically. Economic systems adjusted unevenly. Authority was tested repeatedly. Edward of Woodstock's life unfolded entirely within this atmosphere. To understand him more fully, it helps to place his story alongside the shifting foundations beneath medieval Europe. The Black Death did more than take lives. It altered bargaining power. With labour scarce, surviving workers could negotiate wages. Landowners responded with statutes attempting to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. Enforcement proved difficult. Disputes multiplied. Though the prince belonged to ruling elite, he governed within society, experiencing subtle redistribution of leverage. Aquitaine's resistance to taxation, in part, reflected broader sensitivity to economic pressure. War itself transformed statecraft. Early campaigns under Edward III relied heavily on feudal levies supplemented by contracted soldiers. Over time, more systematic recruitment developed. Indentures, formal contracts between crown and captains, became common. The prince participated directly in this evolution. His armies were not solely feudal retinues, but structured forces assembled through negotiated service. Financial instruments also expanded. Loans from Italian banking houses financed expeditions. Ransoms became calculated sources of revenue. The capture of King John II represented enormous potential payment. Yet collection required stability in France, which was not guaranteed. The prince witnessed how financial expectations could shape diplomatic timelines. In Aquitaine, the delicate question of legal appeals exposed competing notions of sovereignty. Gascon nobles traditionally retained right to appeal to French crown even while acknowledging English overlordship. The prince's refusal to accept such appeals aimed to solidify independent authority. France's insistence on hearing them provided legal pretext for resuming war. Here, law and warfare intertwined inseparably. Such disputes reveal that medieval politics was not solely governed by brute force. Charters, precedents, and oaths carried weight. The prince, trained in both martial and administrative discipline, engaged in these arguments carefully. Yet the balance of power determined which interpretations prevailed. His illness in later years reminds us that medieval medicine operated within humoral theory. Physicians diagnosed imbalance of bodily fluids and prescribed bleeding, diet changes, or herbal remedies. Chronic conditions often persisted untreated by modern standards. The prince endured weakness likely with limited relief. His continued participation in governance despite discomfort reflects expectation that rulers serve regardless of personal condition. The relationship between England and France during his lifetime evolved from aggressive assertion to negotiated settlement and back to war. This cyclical pattern underscores instability of dynastic claims. Edward III's assertion of French crown had galvanized English nobility, yet sustaining such claim required continuous reinforcement. Meanwhile, France's internal recovery under Charles V demonstrates adaptive capacity. Administrative reorganization strengthened royal authority. Reliance on Fabian strategy avoiding open battle, retaking fortresses gradually neutralized English strengths. The prince's earlier triumphs thus belong to specific tactical moment not easily replicated under altered conditions. Within England, social unrest culminated in peasants' revolt shortly after his death. Although he did not witness it, the revolt was rooted in structural issues present during his lifetime taxation for war, labour statutes and economic strain. His support for reform during good parliament suggests awareness that unchecked corruption and financial mismanagement could erode trust. The prince's personal identity blended warrior ethos with administrative seriousness. Unlike some contemporaries portrayed as reckless, he appears consistently measured in record. Even during campaigns, discipline marked his conduct. Plunder occurred, as was customary in chevauchée, yet he maintained organised command rather than chaotic marauding. His marriage to Joan of Kent also reflects complexities of aristocratic alliance. Joan's earlier marital disputes required papal intervention. Their union, though controversial at first, stabilised over time. She bore him children and accompanied him in Aquitaine, reinforcing courtly presence abroad. The death of their eldest son, Edward of Angoulême, was personal tragedy seldom highlighted in martial narratives. Loss of a child in medieval period was common yet devastating. That grief likely intensified attachment to Richard. Such personal dimensions remind us that even figures central to grand events navigated intimate sorrow. Richard II's later reign, marked by tension with nobility and eventual deposition, casts retrospective shadow on Prince's legacy. Had he lived to rule, succession might have unfolded differently. Yet speculation cannot substitute for evidence. Structural tensions facing Richard were not solely product of paternal absence, but of cumulative pressures. In examining his tomb, one notes inscription emphasizing chivalric identity and lineage. The effigy depicts him in armour, hands clasped in prayer. It presents idealized synthesis of warrior and Christian ruler. Medieval monuments often communicated aspiration as much as reality. Over centuries, interpretation of his life has shifted alongside evolving values. Enlightenment historians emphasized rational statecraft over knightly virtue. Romantic writers revived admiration for chivalry. Modern scholarship seeks equilibrium between admiration and critique. Perhaps the enduring appeal of the Black Prince lies in clarity of certain episodes. Cressy and Poitiers offer narrative simplicity. Disciplined army defeating larger force. Such stories align with archetypes of strategic brilliance. Administrative struggles, by contrast, resist simple telling. They involve taxation rates, legal appeals, and fluctuating alliances less dramatic yet equally consequential. In reflecting on his life, one sees interplay between visible heroism and quieter responsibility. Both required skill. One brought acclaim, the other brought friction. He navigated both, though with differing outcomes. The 14th century was not static backdrop, but dynamic context. Demographic shifts, economic adaptation, and military innovation shaped possibilities available to him. He did not control these forces entirely. he responded to them. If we imagine a young Edward standing in hall at Woodstock, unaware of future victories and illness alike, we perceive potential shaped by environment. If we imagine him decades later, weakened yet advising on reform, we perceive continuity of duty despite diminished strength. In that continuity lies coherence of his character. Discipline learned in youth persisted in maturity. Ambition expressed in battle matured into concern for governance. Illness curtailed action but not engagement. If one looks closely at the arc of Edward of Woodstock's reputation, it becomes clear that his life operated at the intersection of two powerful medieval ideas: honour and inheritance. Honour was earned publicly, demonstrated in battle, reinforced through ceremony. Inheritance was fixed at birth, binding him to expectations before he could form independent ambition. Throughout his life, these two forces moved alongside one another, sometimes aligned, sometimes in quiet tension. As heir to Edward III, he did not need to prove his right to succession through political manoeuvring in youth. His legitimacy was secure. Yet that security created its own pressure. Unlike younger sons who might seek land or influence through marriage or adventure, he was defined by singular path: to become king. All preparation was oriented toward that end. The chivalric culture in which he matured emphasized visible courage. A prince who avoided battle risked appearing weak. The campaigns in France offered stage on which he fulfilled these expectations. Crécy and Poitiers did more than secure military advantage. They confirmed publicly that the heir embodied martial competence. Yet inheritance also tied him to structures he did not design. The claim to the French crown originated with his father's ambition and dynastic argument. The prince's campaigns were conducted within that framework. Whether he personally felt deep attachment to French throne as objective, or simply accepted it as duty, is not recorded clearly. Medieval chroniclers rarely preserved introspective reflection. What remains evident is his consistent alignment with policy established before him. His governance in Aquitaine illustrates tension between honour and practicality. Refusing to allow appeals to French crown upheld principle of sovereignty. To concede might have appeared dishonourable or weak. Yet, such firmness contributed to escalation that reignited war. Here, adherence to inherited claim intersected with local realities resistant to simplification. In domestic English politics, he displayed willingness to support reform when corruption threatened legitimacy. During the Good Parliament, his backing of efforts to remove unpopular royal advisers suggests recognition that honour extended beyond battlefield into governance. A prince's reputation depended on fairness as well as force. The fact that he died before inheriting crown introduces poignant dimension. He had been shaped entirely for kingship, yet never exercised it. This interruption invites reflection on contingency. Medieval life expectancy was unpredictable even for nobility. Illness did not discriminate by rank. His son Richard's accession as child king revealed fragility of hereditary systems. The security that had defined Edward's youth did not translate automatically into stability for Richard. Regency councils and factional rivalry replaced singular authority. In that sense, inheritance proved less stable than assumed. Over time, the Black Prince's identity detached somewhat from dynastic context and attached more firmly to personal achievement. Later generations remembered him primarily for Poitiers, rather than for his position as heir who never reigned. This shift underscores power of narrative clarity in shaping memory. The sobriquet Black Prince, though not commonly used during his lifetime, added distinctive tone to remembrance. Whether referencing armour or later romantic embellishment, it contributed to image of severity and strength. Names often outlive nuanced understanding. If we consider daily experience of common people during his lifetime, inheritance and honour appeared distant concepts. Villagers concerned themselves with rents, harvest yields and parish obligations. Yet decisions made in royal councils influenced taxation and security. The prince's life intersected with theirs indirectly but persistently. In Aquitaine, for example, Taxation imposed to fund Castillian campaign affected merchants and landowners directly. Appeals to French crown reflected dissatisfaction rooted partly in financial strain. Governance was not abstract. It manifested in levies and legal disputes that shaped livelihoods. Within broader European context, the 14th century experienced shift toward more bureaucratic administration. Record-keeping expanded. Financial accounts grew more detailed. The prince's era sits within that transition. His campaigns required documentation of ransoms and contracts. His governance involved charters and legal responses. Thus, while he is often remembered as archetypal knight, he also functioned within an increasingly administrative world. The medieval state was evolving, slowly but perceptibly. Military glory alone could not sustain territorial control indefinitely without fiscal and institutional reinforcement. His illness further underscores vulnerability embedded within inheritance. Despite careful preparation and demonstrated ability, succession depended ultimately on health and timing. The crown passed not to him but to his son under different circumstances than anticipated. In reflecting on his life, it is tempting to draw firm conclusions about missed opportunity or inevitable decline. Yet caution is appropriate. His achievements were substantial within context available to him. His limitations were shaped by structural forces beyond personal control. Perhaps what stands out most clearly is consistency of conduct. From youth through illness, records suggest steadiness rather than volatility. He did not dramatically reverse policies nor abandon responsibilities abruptly. He moved through roles commander, governor, reform supporter with measured approach. The world he inhabited was not static tableau of castles and tournaments. It was dynamic environment of trade expansion, demographic recovery after plague, and strategic recalibration between rival monarchies. His life intersected with each of these currents. If one imagines him seated at council table during final months, listening to debate while aware of declining strength, the image conveys blend of resolve and acceptance. He had shaped his era in significant ways. He could not dictate its continuation. If we return again to the fields of France, to the sound of bowstrings tightening and hooves pressing into soft ground, we find that Edward of Woodstock's reputation was not built on a single encounter. Cressy and Poitiers stand prominently in memory, yet between and around them lay campaigns that shaped his understanding of war as prolonged condition rather than isolated clash. The chevauchée that preceded Poitiers deserves closer attention. In 1355, he led mounted forces through Languedoc, deliberately avoiding fortified cities while targeting resources that sustained French resistance. Villages were burned strategically, bridges dismantled, storehouses emptied. The goal was not territorial occupation but economic weakening. This approach required strict coordination. Riders moved swiftly, covering vast distances in weeks. Supply lines were precarious, dependent on what could be seized locally. For those under his command, this kind of warfare demanded endurance. Armour grew heavy in southern heat. Horses required constant care. Discipline prevented fragmentation. The prince's ability to maintain cohesion during such rapid movement reinforced confidence in his leadership. Success was measured not only by territory captured, but by survival and pressure applied. At Poitiers, the tactical arrangement reflected lessons learned from Crécy but adapted to new terrain. Defensive positioning in hedged fields limited French cavalry advantage. Archers flanked and targeted advancing lines. The prince allowed enemy forces to exhaust themselves before committing reserves. When French lines faltered, counterattack was swift and concentrated. The capture of King John II transformed engagement into diplomatic pivot. It was not merely military victory but political upheaval. A reigning monarch in captivity destabilized entire kingdom. The prince understood this leverage. Treatment of the king was calculated to demonstrate superiority without humiliation. Courtesy reinforced chivalric code while strengthening negotiating position. Beyond these well-known battles, the prince also faced sieges and skirmishes less dramatic but equally instructive. The siege of Calais in 1347, though primarily associated with his father, exposed him to prolonged logistical warfare. Maintaining pressure over months required careful provisioning, rotation of forces, and negotiation with surrounding territories. Later, during the Castillian campaign, the Battle of Nargera in 1367 revealed his adaptability in different contexts. Fighting in Iberian terrain against coalition forces aligned with France, he once again relied on disciplined archery and tactical patience. Victory there appeared to reaffirm his brilliance. Yet the political aftermath proved costly when promised funds failed to arrive. War could be won. Its consequences were less predictable. As for the name Black Prince, historians remain uncertain about its origin. Contemporary records during his lifetime rarely use it. One common explanation suggests it referred to the dark armour he may have worn in later years. Blackened plate could have symbolised severity, or simply fashion. Another possibility is that the name emerged later, in the 16th century, as a romantic label attached retrospectively. There is also suggestion that French chroniclers used darker descriptions reflecting devastation of his raids. Yet evidence remains inconclusive. The sobriquet appears solidly in written form long after his death. What is clear is that by early modern period, Black Prince had become accepted identity, shaping how audiences imagined him. The colour black in medieval symbolism did not always signify negativity. It could represent authority, solemnity, or gravity. If he indeed favoured darker armour, it may have conveyed visual distinction on battlefield. Alternatively, later generations may have chosen name that enhanced dramatic aura around his figure. Regardless of precise origin, the name endured because it resonated. It suggested clarity and strength. It separated him from other Edwards in English history. It condensed complex life into memorable phrase. Another story often retold concerns his conduct toward King John II after Poitiers. Chroniclers describe him serving the captured king at table, refusing to sit until his royal prisoner had been honoured. Whether embellished or accurate in detail, the anecdote illustrates how medieval writers sought to frame him as embodiment of knightly restraint. The act symbolised confidence. Only secure victor could afford generosity. His campaigns also influenced military evolution. The effective use of longbowmen under his command contributed to recognition of infantry's central role. English archers, often drawn from rural classes, trained from youth in archery as required by law. Their discipline challenged traditional dominance of mounted knights. The prince's willingness to integrate them strategically demonstrated pragmatism beyond aristocratic pride. It is important to note that warfare under his leadership was not without harshness. Chevauchés inflicted suffering on civilian populations. Towns were forced into submission through threat of destruction. Medieval warfare accepted such tactics as legitimate. Honour among nobles did not necessarily extend to peasantry. This duality complicates romantic image. During renewed conflict after Treaty of Brétigny collapsed, he confronted different style of opposition. Charles V avoided large-scale pitched battles, relying on fortification and attrition. English forces found themselves stretched thin defending scattered strongholds. The prince's declining health limited direct response. War became less decisive, more grinding. His earlier triumphs nonetheless established template. Even adversaries acknowledged his competence. French chroniclers recorded respect mixed with resentment. The fact that later French reformers adapted strategies in response to English tactics reflects impact of his campaigns. In England, ballads and chronicles circulated stories that elevated him into near-mythic status. For common people who would never travel to France, tales of captured king and victorious prince offered narrative of national strength. Such stories strengthened sense of shared identity. His armour displayed at Canterbury remains among earliest surviving full sets of plate. Though likely ceremonial by time of death, it symbolises transition in military equipment during his lifetime. The shift from chainmail to articulated plate reflected broader technological development in warfare. he lived through a period of adaptation. If we imagine him in youth polishing armor before campaign, and decades later too weak to wear it comfortably, the contrast underscores temporal arc of his life. War defined him publicly. Illness defined him privately. 3 additional episodes deserve mention. First, his early participation in the naval Battle of Winchelsea in 1350, where English forces engaged Castillian fleet, threatening Channel trade. Though overshadowed by land battles, this confrontation demonstrated England's need to secure maritime routes. The prince's involvement reinforced understanding that war extended beyond fields into sea lanes. Second, his role in negotiating prisoner exchanges and ransom settlements after Poitiers required diplomatic skill. These negotiations were complex, involving installment payments and territorial concessions. He navigated them carefully, aware that excessive demand could provoke instability. Third, during final phase of his life, he reportedly arranged that his heart be buried in France should he die abroad. Though he ultimately died in England, such sentiment suggests enduring connection to lands where he fought and governed. It reflects layered identity, shaped by years across Channel. The Black Prince's wars were not isolated events but chapters within prolonged continental struggle. His name became shorthand for moment when England's martial confidence peaked visibly. Yet the name, however dramatic, cannot capture full complexity of his life. It points toward battles and armour, but behind it stood administrator wrestling with taxation, husband grieving lost child, father preparing fragile heir. In revisiting his wars and the story of his name, we encounter both clarity and uncertainty. Battles can be described, motivations and meanings require interpretation. If we remain a little longer with the subject of his wars, we begin to see that Edward of Woodstock's military life was not defined solely by brilliance, but by the discipline of repetition. Medieval campaigns required more than bold charges and decisive formations. They required planning months in advance, arranging shipping, negotiating with captains, securing supplies, and maintaining morale over long stretches of uncertainty. The naval dimension of his experience, for example, is often overshadowed by land victories, yet control of the Channel was essential to England's ambitions. In 1350, at the Battle of Winchelsea, sometimes called the Battle of les Espagnols-sur-Mer, the prince fought alongside his father against a Castillian fleet allied with France. The engagement was fierce and personal. Ships grappled and boarded one another. Combat unfolded at close quarters with axes and swords rather than arrows at range. For a commander accustomed to battlefield maneuvering on land, naval combat required adjustment. Balance shifted underfoot. Visibility was constrained by sails and rigging. The prince's participation demonstrated willingness to confront war in multiple forms. Victory secured maritime routes critical for trade and troop movement. It also reinforced understanding that English survival depended as much on sea as on soil. His chevauchés in France reveal another layer of sustained warfare. These mounted raids were not reckless wanderings but calculated demonstrations of reach. By striking deep into enemy territory, the prince forced French commanders to respond or risk appearing ineffective. Yet such strategy depended on speed and coordination. Prolonged presence in hostile land invited encirclement. The march before Poitiers illustrates this delicate balance. The prince's forces, though successful in raiding, found themselves shadowed by larger French army. Negotiations briefly opened possibility of truce. When terms could not be reconciled, confrontation became inevitable. His decision to stand defensively rather than attempt reckless withdrawal reflected caution informed by earlier experience. After Poitiers, management of King John's captivity required tact. The ransom agreed upon 3 million écus was enormous. Payment schedules were arranged. Hostages were exchanged to guarantee installments. The prince understood that humiliating his captive would jeopardize compliance. Respectful treatment aligned with chivalric ideals while safeguarding practical interest. Another often overlooked dimension of his military life is the constant necessity of garrisoning. After major victories, Smaller forts and towns required occupation. Garrison duty lacked drama but demanded vigilance. Supplies had to be delivered regularly. Communication between scattered outposts needed maintenance. In Aquitaine, such responsibilities fell increasingly under his oversight. When war resumed in 1369, French strategy shifted deliberately away from pitched battles that favoured English archery. Charles V appointed commanders who specialised in recapturing strongholds systematically. The prince's earlier victories did not guarantee advantage in this altered environment. Fortresses surrendered gradually under pressure, sometimes without dramatic resistance. It was during this phase that his declining health limited direct participation. Illness likely reduced mobility and stamina. Medieval commanders often led from front lines. Absence could affect morale. Though he delegated authority effectively, his physical withdrawal altered symbolic centre of resistance. Stories from this later period sometimes portray him as stern in taxation yet firm in purpose. Gascon nobles who appealed to French crown cited financial burdens as grievance. Whether his levies were excessive by contemporary standards remains debated, but the fact of resistance is clear. War abroad required funding at home. Resources were finite. As for the name Black Prince, another theory occasionally suggested by historians links it to heraldic contrast. His personal arms quartered France and England were set against dark surcoat in some depictions. However, contemporary sources from his lifetime simply refer to him as the Prince of Wales or Edward of Woodstock. The sobriquet gains consistent appearance only in Tudor-era chronicles. The delay in adoption of the nickname suggests that later generations felt need to distinguish him clearly among multiple Edwards in royal lineage. The colour black added distinctiveness and perhaps dramatic tone, suitable to Renaissance sensibilities looking back at medieval past. It is also worth considering that black in medieval context could signify solemnity rather than malevolence. Clergy sometimes wore black robes. It conveyed seriousness. If he favoured darker armour late in life, perhaps blackened through use or design, it might have projected gravity befitting heir apparent. Another story occasionally retold concerns his conduct at the siege of Limoges in 1370. According to some chroniclers, after the town surrendered to French forces and was later retaken by the English, severe punishment followed. Later accounts accused the prince of ordering massacre. Modern historians debate extent of violence, noting that numbers reported in some sources may be exaggerated. The episode illustrates difficulty of disentangling legend from evidence. Medieval chroniclers often amplified events to emphasize moral lessons or political critique. While warfare certainly involved harsh reprisals, precise scale at Limoges remains uncertain. What is clear is that such incidents contributed to mixed perception in French memory. Thus, his wars generated admiration in England and resentment in parts of France. Reputation depends partly on vantage point. To English chroniclers, he was defender of rightful claim. To French communities subjected to chevauchée, he represented destructive incursion. His participation in the Castillian campaign likewise had layered consequences. At Nájera, his tactical discipline prevailed. Yet the failure of Peter of Castile to fulfill financial promises left Aquitaine strained. The victory, though militarily clear, undermined his administrative position indirectly. One might imagine him reflecting during those years on unpredictability of alliance. Medieval politics rested on personal agreements sealed by oath and reinforced by mutual interest. When interest shifted, promises faltered. The prince's reliance on Peter's payments proved optimistic. Even so, his commitment to allies reflects adherence to broader strategic vision. Preventing French dominance in Iberia aligned with England's long-term interest. Short-term cost was accepted in pursuit of perceived stability. By the time of his return to England in 1371, the cumulative weight of campaigns and illness had altered his capacity. The once tireless commander now moved with difficulty. Yet his reputation remained anchored in earlier victories. He had demonstrated that English forces, when disciplined and strategically placed, could defeat larger armies. In studying his wars, one sees pattern of calculated aggression rather than reckless ambition. He avoided unnecessary risk when possible. Defensive positioning at Poitiers was chosen deliberately. Even during chevauchées, retreat was considered carefully to avoid entrapment. His military life therefore reflects strategic intelligence shaped by experience rather than impulsive daring alone. The romantic image of knight charging without hesitation oversimplifies reality. His successes relied on preparation, terrain assessment, and coordinated command. The name Black Prince may evoke shadowed armour and dramatic presence, but beneath that title lay methodical planner attentive to supply, morale, and negotiation. His wars were not merely spectacles, they were sustained operations embedded within economic and political systems. There is one more way to understand Edward of Woodstock's wars, by looking not only at what he won, but at what those victories changed. Battles are often described as turning points, yet their consequences unfold gradually. The prince's campaigns reshaped expectations about what English arms could achieve, and in doing so, they influenced both allies and enemies long after he left the field. Before Cressy, English armies had not established consistent pattern of defeating larger French forces in open battle. Medieval warfare traditionally privileged heavily armoured cavalry. Mounted knights symbolised dominance, yet at Cressy, and again at Poitiers, disciplined infantry supported by longbowmen proved decisive. The prince's participation in these engagements helped validate new tactical equilibrium. Archery training in England had long been encouraged through law. Parish communities were required to practice. What had once been local defence measure evolved into national military advantage. Under the prince's command, archers were integrated strategically rather than treated as auxiliary support. This innovation carried consequences far beyond single generation. French commanders studied these defeats carefully. Charles V's subsequent avoidance of large-scale pitched battles reflected recognition that frontal assault against entrenched archers invited disaster. Thus, in an indirect way, the prince's success shaped enemy adaptation. War became more about attrition, siegecraft, and territorial recovery than about dramatic confrontation. In Aquitaine, his early presence brought relative stability, but prolonged conflict revealed limits of expansion. English rule in the region depended on cooperation from local elites. When taxation increased and legal disputes intensified, loyalty shifted. War had expanded territory quickly. Maintaining it required sustained legitimacy. The Siege of Limoges in 1370 illustrates complexity of later phase. The town had shifted allegiance to French side. When English forces retook it, chroniclers recorded severe punishment. Whether numbers were exaggerated or not, the event entered narrative as darker episode. For French memory, it represented harshness of occupation. For English chroniclers, it signalled determination to suppress betrayal. Such divergence in interpretation reminds us that warfare creates layered memory. Victories celebrated in one land are mourned in another. The Black Prince's name carries resonance across Channel precisely because his campaigns touch both societies deeply. His final years were marked not by battlefield glory, but by gradual withdrawal from direct command. Illness forced delegation. John of Gaunt assumed more visible leadership in renewed campaigns. Yet even as physical strength declined, the prince's earlier victories continued to shape English morale. He embodied period when expansion seemed achievable. Another aspect of his military legacy lies in integration of contractual service. Indentures formalised relationship between crown and captains. Payment for service became more structured. This system would continue developing in later centuries, contributing to professionalisation of armies. The prince's campaigns operated within this evolving framework. The ransoming system following Poitiers also reflected broader economic dimension of medieval warfare. Captured nobles were assets. Negotiations involved careful calculation. The prince's handling of King John II demonstrated awareness that diplomacy intertwined with combat. War generated revenue as well as territory. Even the choice of burial with armour displayed speaks to martial identity. Few medieval tombs preserve equipment so prominently. Whether the armor was fully functional or ceremonial at time of display, it symbolized life defined by warfare. Visitors encountering that display in Canterbury would have been reminded immediately of his military stature. The origin of the name Black Prince, as discussed earlier, likely solidified in Tudor period. Chroniclers such as Polydore Virgil and later writers popularized the term. By then, medieval past was being reinterpreted through Renaissance sensibilities, a dramatic epithet-enhanced narrative appeal. The persistence of that name suggests power of story over strict documentation. Though contemporary records did not emphasize it, later generations embraced it because it condensed image effectively. In collective memory, Edward of Woodstock became the Black Prince, a figure of dark armour and decisive battles. Yet if we strip away romantic veneer, we find disciplined commander who understood terrain, supply, morale, and diplomacy. His wars were structured enterprises requiring cooperation across social strata. Archers from rural villages, knights from noble families, sailors guarding channel, all contributed to outcomes attributed to him. When considering his life in total, one sees that his reputation rests not solely on aggression, but on competence within context. He operated effectively in early phase of Hundred Years' War, when French strategy favoured confrontation. When enemy adapted, structural pressures limited continuation of success. If he had lived longer, might he have adjusted to new strategic landscape? It is possible. His record suggests flexibility rather than rigidity, yet illness curtailed opportunity for adaptation. In that sense, contingency played decisive role. The three wars most associated with him, Crécy, Poitiers, and Nájera, form arc of rising mastery. The final years, marked by siege warfare and territorial loss, reflect complexity of prolonged conflict. Together, they compose narrative not of unbroken triumph, but of evolving challenge. In English historical consciousness, he represents high medieval chivalry at its confident peak. In French memory, he represents formidable adversary whose raids brought hardship. Both perspectives are rooted in reality. As we reach the later chapters of his story, we are reminded that even the most celebrated commanders exist within shifting systems. Tactics that succeed in one decade may falter in next. Alliances that appear secure may dissolve. Health that sustains vigour may falter unexpectedly. If we gather together the strands of his military life, his illness, his governance, and the stories told about him afterward, we begin to see Edward of Woodstock not as a figure carved cleanly in stone, but as a man moving through a century that refused simplicity. War was constant companion, but it was never the only force shaping his decisions. One final element of his campaigns deserves attention: endurance over time. Medieval chronicles often compress years into a few lines, yet campaigns stretched across seasons. Armies disbanded in winter and reassembled in spring. Horses had to be fed, equipment repaired, alliances renewed. The prince's leadership required long-term organization rather than momentary inspiration. In Aquitaine especially, he confronted reality that territory is easier to win than to keep. Garrisons stationed in fortified towns required supply and payment. Local populations expected protection in exchange for loyalty. When finances ran thin after the Castillian expedition, tension rose quickly. The prince's earlier victories did not exempt him from economic arithmetic. His refusal to recognize French appellate authority over Gascon nobles was rooted in defense of sovereignty established at Brétigny. Yet that legal dispute became catalyst for renewed war. It demonstrates that medieval conflict did not arise solely from battlefield confrontation, but from interpretation of charters and rights. Law and arms operated together. The Battle of Nájera, though often celebrated as final great victory of his career, also marked a turning point. Physically, it may have been where illness took hold. Politically, it failed to secure stable alliance in Iberia. Strategically, it extended English commitments without providing reliable compensation. Thus, even triumph carried seeds of difficulty. When French strategy shifted under Charles V toward avoidance of open battle, English forces found themselves challenged differently. Instead of dramatic confrontation, they faced incremental erosion. Fortresses fell one by one. This type of warfare required sustained funding and patience, both difficult to maintain amid domestic pressures. The episode at Limoges remains controversial in historical writing. Some accounts accuse him of ordering widespread slaughter after the town changed allegiance. Modern historians debate the scale, noting that medieval sources often exaggerated numbers for moral effect. What is significant is that such narratives influenced French perception of him. In memory, he could appear ruthless rather than chivalrous. That duality, courteous victor at Poitiers, stern commander at Limoges, illustrates complexity of medieval warfare. Honour among nobles did not preclude harsh reprisals against towns deemed disloyal. The prince operated within norms of his era, though later centuries judged those norms differently. The origin of the title Black Prince continued to evolve in retelling. By the 16th century, chroniclers such as Raphael Holinshed used it confidently. Shakespeare's era inherited that terminology. The name carried dramatic weight suited to Renaissance fascination with medieval past. It distinguished him sharply from Edward III and Richard II in narrative tradition. Interestingly, the nickname may also have resonated with later English audiences because it suggested gravity and strength without overt cruelty. Black in heraldic and symbolic language could imply dignity and seriousness. Whatever its exact origin, the sobriquet helped fix his image in popular consciousness. When modern visitors walk into Canterbury Cathedral and see the effigy with armour suspended above, they encounter not simply relic of past, but culmination of storytelling. The armour appears darkened by age, reinforcing visual connection to nickname. It creates impression of warrior at rest, though beneath effigy lies complex life beyond battlefield. Looking at his final years, one observes quiet persistence. Even as illness weakened him, he remained engaged in council. He supported efforts to address corruption. He ensured recognition of his son as heir. These acts lack spectacle yet reveal steady commitment to duty. His death in 1376 removed figure who combined martial authority with political awareness. Within a year, Edward III also died. Richard II's accession ushered in a period marked by youth, factionalism, and social unrest. The peasants' revolt of 1381, though beyond his lifetime, unfolded within framework shaped partly by policies of earlier reign. Would his presence have altered that course? Possibly in tone, perhaps in outcome, yet structural forces, economic strain, demographic shifts, prolonged war, would still have demanded resolution. No individual, however capable, commands entire century alone. His wars left imprint not only on military practice but on national identity. English confidence in longbow and disciplined infantry trace back to victories in which he played central role. French reforms responded to challenges he helped expose. Thus, even after territorial gains faded, tactical lessons endured. If we imagine him once more as young commander at Cressy, facing overwhelming force yet holding position, we see determination shaped by training and expectation. If we imagine him years later in Westminster, weakened but attentive, we see similar determination expressed differently. The name Black Prince now carries centuries of interpretation layered upon it. It conjures dark armour, decisive battles, chivalric courtesy. Yet behind it stood Edward of Woodstock, heir trained from childhood for kingship, warrior tested by circumstance, governor challenged by complexity, father concerned for succession. Now the armour has grown still. The banners that once snapped above him in French wind have long since fallen into threads of dust. The horses are quiet, the longbows no longer hum. The halls of Bordeaux, the fields of Poitiers, the decks at Winchelsea all have settled into memory. Edward of Woodstock lived in a century that demanded strength early and offered little certainty in return. He learned to command before he fully understood the cost. He carried expectations placed upon him at birth and never truly laid them down. He won battles that reshaped Europe's confidence. He governed lands that resisted easy rule. He bore illness without spectacle. He prepared a son for a crown he would never wear himself. For those who marched beside him, war was mud, fear, and discipline. For those who opposed him, it was disruption and recovery. For those at home, it was taxation, prayer, and waiting. And now, centuries later, what remains is not the clash of steel, but the quiet outline of a life shaped by its time.